You're listening to the Security Matters podcast. I'm David Puner, a senior editorial manager at CyberArk, the global leader in identity security. Imagine this scenario. A major retail chain is in the middle of its busiest shopping season. Shoppers jam checkout lines, employees restock shelves at record speed, and credit cards dip and swipe in a rhythmic pulse. But behind the scenes, something isn't right. An attacker, maybe an insider, maybe someone who just walked in off the street, manages to plug a small, inconspicuous device into a point-of-sale terminal. At first, nothing seems off. Transactions process as usual. But the retailer's entire payment system is compromised. The attacker is siphoning credit card data and cloning credentials. The worst part? The breach isn't detected until customers start reporting fraudulent charges days later. This scenario isn't just hypothetical. Retail, one of the most targeted sectors for cyber attacks, faces singular challenges where digital security meets real-world exposure. From AI-powered phishing scams to evolving ransomware threats, attackers are becoming more sophisticated. The good news? Leaders like our guest today are working to stay ahead of these threats, integrating AI-driven defenses, strengthening cyber resilience, and ensuring that the trust between retailers and consumers remains intact. Let's dive in. Jason James, Chief Information Officer at Aptos Retail. Thanks so much for coming onto the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me today.
Really excited to talk to you. We haven't really gone deep on retail on the podcast in a while, or maybe ever. We'll have to dial that up at some point. But in your role as CIO of Aptos Retail, what does the role entail and what's your career path been to CIO?
So in my current role, I oversee our cloud operations. I oversee our global internal IT group, which manages everything from our CRM systems to our business systems to assisting with our talent management systems with HR, any kind of business intelligence, as well as I have teams that lead our cybersecurity and compliance divisions. We're one of the largest software companies in the world that focus on pure retail. So that's everything from point of sale to order management to CRM, but specifically in the retail space. Interesting way to think about it. If you go in the mall, it's everyone but the anchor stores. So companies like Michael Kors and New Balance and Crocs and others, that's who we're serving. And so we serve that as a software service and platform. And the road to get here, wow, that was a winding road. Every job I've ever had has been in technology. I live in Atlanta. I grew up a couple hours south of here in Alabama. And at 15, when kids were mowing lawns and working in grocery stores and taking their first retail jobs, I was laying out Lantastic networks and doing PC upgrades. And so every job I've ever had has been in technology. I don't know anything else. And so I've worked in different sectors. I've worked in telecom. I've worked in pure enterprise tech. I'd worked in retail analytics before. I did a stint as a CIO in two healthcare tech organizations, and now I'm back in retail. Really, the underlying common denominator has been on infrastructure, data center, cloud computing, SaaS delivery of it all. If the internet made every company a tech company, what we're looking at now is AI is making every tech company an AI company. And so we're playing in that space as well.
Really interesting path, and we will certainly be getting into AI in a few minutes. But let's go back for a second to when you were a teen and everybody else was mowing lawns and doing probably retail jobs and stuff like that. And you were doing what?
I was laying out Lantastic networks. So think of it as almost like networking for dummies.
Okay.
The idea of small, medium businesses networking together. This is when organizations had 3, 4 desktops that they were connecting together to be able to share data. And I think about now, I mean, me, my wife, and kids, there's 40, 50 IP addresses within our house, everything from a smart thermostat to doorbell to our laptops and tablets. That's larger than any of the networks I worked on probably up until my college days.
So that obviously was an early passion of yours, and this is kind of where you are now is ultimately the result of pursuing this passion?
Yeah, I would say it's a combination of not only the tech aspect of it, but that entrepreneurial spirit. If you think about those early jobs, that was a form of consulting. I was going out to small businesses that I would know or my dad would know that would need help. And when I started my academic career off at Auburn University, I ended up buying the value added reseller I was working for when I was 19 and taking a sabbatical from school. I would later finish my degree, go back to school. I was traveling the world full time, but would later get my undergrad from Oregon State, my master's in applied information management from the University of Oregon. But having that entrepreneurial spirit and trying to solve a business problem with the use of technology made me a CIO long before the title was given to me.
In your current role, CIO of Aptos Retail, are you both outward and inward facing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you think about the day to day, right, you've got certain things where you're keeping the lights on. That's just table stakes. That's what every CIO is doing. That's everything from the business systems to data integrity to internal security. Now, I'm also out there interfacing with our largest clients. What are the security needs that they have? How do we differentiate our products? How do we help with their upgrades, their deployments? How do we get that out into the field? How do we help them? How do we use our technology to make their business more efficient? How do we use it to drive profitability? And I'm not out there selling, but I'm acting as a sounding board because CIOs want to talk to other CIOs and how do we do this? What problems are you having? And it goes beyond sometimes that what we're doing and what we serve them and how I can connect them to others to help them. And it might be everything from a ERP implementation to security initiative. But the idea is they have that internal champion that they can come to.
So, retail is one of the most targeted sectors by cyber attackers. Why is it so heavily targeted, and how does it compare to other highly targeted industries? Are the challenges you face in retail different from those in other industries or sectors? Kind of, you mentioned healthcare earlier. You were in healthcare.
So when you think about it, the three most attacked sectors in the United States are finance. The threat actors are going to go where the money's at. The second one is healthcare or healthcare tech. And the third is retail. Retail, again, poses similar challenges that I've faced in healthcare. You might have seasonal or hourly workers, making sure those people are trained, making sure they understand. I think what makes retail a targeted sector is it's easy to touch. What business can you go in and go all the way up to the actual register that takes in money? Think about it. You walk into a mall, you can touch the point of sale systems, you can touch the register. Now, let me say, you should not. But the fact is, physically, you can get to that. That's not true in an enterprise space. You can't easily walk in a software company's, get past their lobby and get to one of the desktops. It's much, much harder to get to. With that said, is that those entry points are less secure. So for a threat actor coming on and putting on some kind of credit card skimmer, some kind of USB device, it's a lot easier to do because the physical barriers to entry aren't there like you would be. The thing about retail, it's a customer driven, customer centric business. And so you want to be in front of the client. You don't want to set up those barriers. And with that becomes a different level of protection. And so I think what you're also going to see is the fact is retail is something that a ton of people have worked in early in their career. Maybe they were teenagers, maybe they were in college, but they have a familiarity with it. It's much like I read a stat one time, not that it has to do with retail, but 1 in 10 Americans at one point had worked for McDonald's. And I would say that stat is probably similar to how many Americans, and it's probably more, have worked in retail at some point in their career. And so that level of understanding has also translated into those hackers that have experience working in those environments and know how to exploit it from the human factor side.
A lot of considerations, that's for sure. So, when you think then about retail, and of course, you take everybody who works in retail, there's all the consumers who interact with retail. So, what is your perspective on consumer trust and its relation to security and how it plays into retail as well?
Yeah, I think it's a big impact when you think about how much brand loyalty we have as consumers. I don't know, David, what kind of shoes you have on, but you probably have a big preference when it comes to sneakers. And I think that's true with many buyers. And so, with that, it's very important that retailers want to protect that relationship. If you think about how relationships get damaged, especially at the consumer level, is by a reduction in trust. And that can happen when data is not protected, systems aren't protected. And then the last thing you want to be mailing out is, hey, your social security got compromised, your credit card got compromised, your transactions or whatnot. And so retailers want to protect that. And so what you have now is more and more are investing in next generation technologies. If you would go back probably 5 or 6 years ago, the majority of them were still on traditional antivirus versus next gen endpoint detection and response. And so you see a lot of investments being made to protect that data because ultimately it protects that relationships and ensures that trust and ultimately brand loyalty.
So, is protecting retail data different than protecting healthcare data? How do the varying regulations in other industries affect the approach to security?
Data is data. How you protect it is virtually the same. What changes, to your point, David, is the penalties for violating that data. When I think about penalties for violating credit card data with PCI regulations, very different than HIPAA. If you think about HIPAA related data and those kinds of penalties around it, um, US Marshals can show up at your door. A little bit different than Amex or MasterCard saying, hey, you need to reissue credit cards. With that said, coming from that healthcare background, I made sure that I took on the highest level of resiliency and security and best practices from a more highly regulated industry and brought them into retail. Again, that idea is how do you look for next generation technology? How do you segment data? How are you making sure you're restricting access when it's not needed in order to provide the best practices in place to secure data, even though it's retail data? It's still incredibly important. Again, we talked about the importance of violation of trust and what that means to brand loyalty. And so I've been able to take what worked in enterprise global tech, what worked in healthcare, and bring those into the retail sector.
So, how do you ensure compliance with standards like PCI or PCI DSS while maintaining a seamless customer shopping experience?
Yeah, I think number one, you build it in from a shift left initiative. So if you think about how you're developing software, take the IBM quote, it's 6 times more expensive to correct a security issue once it goes in an implementation. What you have to do is build that security, build that compliance in from the beginning. Compliance is just a measurement of your security. Compliance and security aren't the same. It's just allowing a third party to say, hey, do you walk the walk? Do you talk the talk?
Hmm.
And so once you build in those policies, once you build in those frameworks, once you build in those technologies from the beginning, it just becomes part of your DNA and who you are as an organization and who you are as a company. And so from our standpoint, compliance, security is utmost important of protecting not only ourselves, but our client data.
You had mentioned cyber resiliency a moment ago. What does retail cyber resilience look like, and how can retail organizations build cyber resilience?
Number one, when you think about it's not just cyber resiliency, it's resiliency. So the last thing you want to do as a retailer is impact the transaction. If you think about the fragility of environments, whether they be a Wi-Fi at a mall or a temporary network at a pop-up event or a event like a marathon or impacts like what we saw last year with CrowdStrike, the idea is do you have a system in place that can withstand disruptions? And so luckily, with our product, we're able to build a highly resilient product that allows people in the event of disruption to be able to continue the transaction. We've all been in malls during that holiday season. We've all been in stores in that holiday season. The last thing you want to be doing is waiting in line trying to buy that perfect gift for you or a loved one, and you can't check out.
Hmm.
Man, that is so painful, not only from a buyer perspective, but when you think about the empathetic view of looking at the poor seasonal employee standing behind the counter, is just like, I just want to check these people out, be able to get this done and go home. And so resiliency is important. We still live in a very fragile environment. I mean, at any point, my network could go down while we're recording this. And I'm lucky enough, I have several forms of connectivity back at my home. Not everybody has that ability. And I would say it's a perk of being a CIO and working in the industry for so long and understanding there is a fragility of network connectivity and disruptions. And any retailer, the more, and I'm not pitching us, I'm just saying in general, the more you can build a resilient model into your systems, the more you can protect the revenue and protect ultimately goes back to that customer trust.
Speaking of those seasonal employees and the hourly workers and everybody else who touches all of this stuff, how enormous a hurdle is it to properly train retail employees to be cyber aware, cyber savvy, whatever it might be?
I think it's really difficult. Number one is with any training, regardless if it's seasonal or if it's an enterprise employee, how can you make the training condensed and yet interesting? If you think about cybersecurity, we read about it every day. It is super fascinating. When you think about how deepfakes are changing what we do and how we interact with people when it comes to wire transfers and how we do verification, it becomes super interesting. But I think what ultimately has to happen, you have to have it as part of your training procedures, right? You've got loss avoidance and how do you deal with shoplifters, but how do you deal with recognizing that, oh wait, that USB dongle wasn't on my workstation yesterday. What's happening? It's important because, like we said, retail is one of those industries where you can more easily get to the physical devices and your workers, regardless of being seasonal or full time, they're your front line of defense. Regardless of how good artificial intelligence has gotten, our best systems are still human. And so being able to recognize a pattern, and a pattern is, hey, that dongle wasn't there yesterday. Who do I report this to? It has to be part of the training. But again, what you don't want is some lengthy computer based training where you're clicking through and then people just get to the point where they click, click, click and don't pay attention. How do you bring that awareness into play? One of the things I do is in leading security teams is I have live sessions. And so we do this thing called cybersecurity AMA where it's me and members of my security team. We talk about what we're seeing in the industry. We talk about what we're seeing in terms of threats. We talk about the tools and the new technologies we're using. And then we open it up for anybody to ask questions. We want to make it lively. We want to make it interactive, but we also want to make it interesting enough and relatable enough that they're not only care about protecting our corporate data, they care about protecting their own personal data.
Mm-hmm.
If I can get people to care about how they protect their own data, ultimately it will be reflected in how they protect our data.
Yeah, and that makes sense. It's all intertwined. I
Right.
mean, you can talk about organizational security or individual security, but it's the individuals that comprise an organization or whatever it may be, a company, organization, industry.
Absolutely.
It all boils down to individual. Um, then getting into emerging threats, this is very broad, but how do you stay ahead of emerging threats? How do you prepare to defend against the unknown?
Number one, it becomes part of your ongoing refresh of training and learning. So that means how am I interacting with our largest security partners? How am I interacting with other CISOs? How am I interacting with other CIOs and CTOs? And what's working? What are they seeing? Of course, I've got intelligence threads where I'm constantly getting updates about what we're seeing and alerts and things like that. But it has to be more than that. It has to be how do I build these relationships with the largest leaders in the industry and figure out what's happening. How do I see that? What do we see coming? It's so much harder now to be a CIO or CISO than it was. And I'll just take the CIO sort of helmet for now, but than it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, CIOs did one ERP implementation in a 4 year period, a 10-year period, and that's about all they did. Occasionally a virus might pop up. There's no nation state attacks. There's no global pandemic. There was no work from anywhere and deep fakes and wire transfer scams. And so right now is not only the most challenging, but also the most interesting time to be in the seat.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to stay in the seat, you have to be constantly out there interacting, constantly learning, constantly making sure you're up to date on what's happening and everything you can't see. That's why you have the next generation security partners to help protect your assets.
Getting more specifically into the cyber threats du jour, what are some of the most significant cyber threats you're seeing in the retail space, and how has the threat landscape evolved over the last year or so? What's changed, and how has your approach to defense and protection evolved along with it?
Still, one of the most common things you see are phishing leading to ransomware.
Hmm.
I think what we're seeing a year later than what we saw a year ago is how good the phishing's gotten,
Yeah.
right? It's being created by Gen AI. And so there's no grammatical mistakes, there's no spelling mistakes. It's using context that's being correlated from social media, whether it be LinkedIn or others, to understand the hierarchy and building out these almost real world scenarios. So you'd see these phishing attempts come in, or maybe even a wire transfer scam, and you see the message. And what they've done is they've built these entire conversations. So when it ultimately gets to someone, it's a series of emails that seem to have gone back and forth, and they haven't. When you drop out and you look at your email system and you're just like, this never occurred. But you look at the message and it's like, oh, well, this is a message going from the controller back to the VP of finance to someone in sales issuing a credit, and it needs to go here. And what you're looking at when you actually read the story is that the story that's been entirely created in Gen AI using data that they've correlated from social media to understand an organizational hierarchy and how to actually institute it within an organization that would make sense if a junior employee that had not necessarily keys to the kingdom, but keys to some private assets, whether it be bank accounts or other things. And so that's getting harder. So you still see those, that's still under attack. You still see that going on in organizations with a greater sophistication. That's why training becomes so important. Training can't be annual. If you're relying on annual training, you're already falling behind. Studies have shown that's just not effective. People get too busy in their day-to-day lives and forget about it. I think when you think about nation state attacks and the kind of data you're protecting, what kind of environments are they in? Are you still traditionally on site? Or are you using these global hypervisors that have the ability to really combat large denial of service attacks that you wouldn't be able to do from your server room in Cleveland, Ohio, so to speak? And so I think when you think about where investments are coming in that, you see organizations in retail moving even more to the cloud or moving to top tier traditional data centers where they may have a managed service offering and going through those routes if they're doing more traditional co-location versus pure cloud.
You mentioned a lot there that I'd like to dive into deeper. Let's start with AI and Gen AI. So, how is AI and generative AI transforming retail? And so that could be in the way of threats or in the way that retail itself is actually operating. And what are the security implications? What are some promising ways that AI can assist retail security on top of that?
There's a lot we can talk about with AI and retail and how people are using it to be able to gather trends in their analytics. If you think about a lot of organizations, perhaps they don't have data scientists. They have people that understand the business. And so how do you use AI to take that data and present it in a way where they could say in a chat format, again, a generative format, what was my top selling item this month? What was my worst selling item? What do we have in this inventory for this size? And be able to get that data back by using natural language selection. Incredibly powerful. When we think about it on the cybersecurity perspective, artificial intelligence becomes even more powerful. If you think about trends and what happens as threat actors and nation states and others start probing a network, it's not a massive, hey, I'm just going to hammer an environment and try to do a brute force attack. A lot of times what we're seeing now are slow discovery points. And having that artificial intelligence to go, whoa, that IP started sniffing around 3 weeks ago. What's happening? What do those trends look like? And when we think about pattern recognition, now we're looking at pattern recognition over long periods of time with minute movement.
Hmm.
That's where it becomes really powerful in order to go, something could happen here. If we think about these trends and take out that sort of trending line, it becomes the art of the probable. What could happen? And I think that's a very powerful play. Not to mention, if you think about a modern sort of endpoint detection response, how it's using AI to go look at that behavior at a fast pace when things are happening very quickly and where they're coming from, whether they be, IPs or behavioral based analysis to go, hey, David doesn't normally try to log in as JJ and go to elevate his credentials using Power BI and go to the finance director, right? And be able to detect that very quickly is important. But taking that data that's happening very quickly and analyzing it very quickly, where it becomes the most powerful is acting on those data, right? How do I go ahead and block that IP? How do I go ahead and disable that account and then escalate an alert out? And so most organizations don't have enough people, and especially don't have enough well trained cybersecurity professionals. And so where that job deficiency is coming from at a nationwide perspective is coming from the advancements in artificial intelligence, especially on the cybersecurity side, regardless of industry.
So then what about AI agents? As AI agents move beyond task automation, their potential and risk expand significantly. What's your perspective on AI agents and associated emerging threats?
When you think about it, instead of AI operating as a pure function in order to say, hey, reset my password or hand me this data or whatever, is as you start to look ahead in the next few years, is this AI agents not talking back to humans, but talking back to each other and exchanging data, whether they be through APIs or other calls. And I think where we have to start looking at is what is monitoring those, right? Because once those become compromised, the ability for an attack to spread at a much quicker rate is highly possible. And I think what we're going to see is as AI starts to move to agentic base, where it's talking not just to humans, but talking to each other and executing on data. How do we protect those systems? How do we segment those systems? And how do we monitor against compromise? If we think about one of the largest impacts in an organization is internal threat, what we're going to see in the future is internal threat will be non-human internal threat. And being able to protect from that is going to be crucial. And we're in the early stages,
Right, right.
right? We're in the early stages of what it can do. And it's evolving at an alarming rate. I just saw this stat. I shared it with a friend of mine that works at a very large computer manufacturer. And the stat was how much the largest players were spending on data center infrastructure in 2025. Google, 75 billion, Microsoft, 80 billion, Stargate, 100 billion, Amazon, 100 billion, Meta, 65 billion. When you add that up, it's wartime spending. What we're looking at is our generation's version of the Manhattan Project in terms of infrastructure being built out to power AI. And with that, the advancements are coming faster and the risks are coming faster than we can prepare for. Eventually, something will happen. We don't know what that looks like. And I'm not talking about AI becoming sentient and launching nuclear attacks. What I'm talking about is what happens when we compromise these agents that have the keys to the kingdom and we've put in so much faith in them because they're not human. We have to understand that even non-human operators can become compromised.
Mm-hmm.
When we think about the interoperability of systems, for so long we've looked at systems and thought about the importance of interconnectivity and API calls and things like that. And now what we're doing is setting agents within all those systems. These agents are being created at an alarming rate across the enterprise. And what I mean by that is Workday, own AI agents, Salesforce, its own AI agents. Every enterprise tool that you can think of, Microsoft, Copilot, everything has an AI component being either bundled or an add-on or being put into it. But with that said, there's not this sort of end all be all yet AI agent that sits across all of our systems and operates as a human operator. So what will eventually happen is that could happen, but what we're going to see first and foremost is these particular embedded agents and co-pilots or whatever you want to call them that are embedded within these tools will go from talking to us to talking to themselves in order to increase our productivity. that's where the level of protection, that's where a level of being able to scan across systems. And again, I'm going to take back to that endpoint detection and response, is that it'll be more than just the file systems itself and the systems itself. It'll be broad based where they'll have to have interconnectivity into SaaS based organizations and SaaS based clouds to be able to look at that data and being almost asking and saying, what did you say? What did you ask for? Why are you asking for that? And it'll happen at a very fast pace so it doesn't slow down sort of transactional speed, but it's coming.
What are the ramifications between how you're managing and protecting machine identity now, or machine identities now, and how things will evolve based on the scenarios that you're talking about?
When you think about how do you protect machines now, is you look at what is your identity management system? How are you restricting identity? How are you verifying identity? I think in a certain way, it doesn't change when we talk about this in the future. Where it changes is that it's more than just at the machine level or the more the system level. It's across system, across SaaS, across the ecosystems, interconnected ecosystems, and how they correspond. And how do you identify it in a way where do you have access? Are you supposed to have access at this time? How long are you supposed to have access? Just because I gave you access to this system, are you supposed to have access to this particular data? And as data gets a lot more granular and becoming more granular, all that becomes much more important. I think what we're seeing is you still have organizations out there that are still trying to figure out their identity strategy. And what we're talking about is the underlying environments that are coming in so quickly and technology is being added so quickly that we're going to have to adapt. And I think organizations that have thought that out and are starting to put, I won't say restrictions in place, but frameworks in place, compliance in place to be able to measure that and make sure that's happening and going through and making sure they have audits, whether they be internal or external security audits to come back and check groups, all that becomes important. I think what has to happen is as these attacks get larger, as the cost to remediate security issues and remediate attacks happen, is you're going to continue to see increasing cybersecurity insurance rates. The ability to get insurance becomes harder. And so organizations are going to have larger, I won't say barriers to entry, but larger cost concerns when it comes to having compliance that verifies what we're doing, not only in the identity space, but cybersecurity as a whole.
What are the biggest identity challenges you're focused on or your customers are focused on? And how does identity figure into the retail and e-commerce equation?
Yeah, I think when you think about that is you've got such granular, and I'll take retail for example, you've got very granular needs when it comes to identity. If you think about a traditional retail store, who is allowed access to the point of sale? And it becomes even more granular. Who's allowed to give a credit back? How many times have you been in a retail store and they ran you up wrong? I was in the grocery store the other day and they swiped something twice. They couldn't even delete that. They had to come and get a manager over there because the cost of the item, it wasn't like a $2 thing. I don't remember what it was. And to get an override, that had to come from a manager. And so that's another level of identity. And for him, I noticed his identity was a physical key.
Wow.
So not only he put a physical key and he turned it and then put it in code into the point of sale system. So it was almost a two-factor authentication when you think about it, right?
Yeah.
The fact is he had a key that basically unlocked, and then there was a pen of some sort that he typed in to be able to do the override, I guess because the override was over a certain amount. But uh, so retailers have a different form of more granular identity that they need to be able to vet for. And sometimes it's at the point of sale system. Sometimes it's in the, I'll say back office when it comes to order management and orders and then into their own internal systems and ERP. And so it makes it challenging for them because you've got physical stores in many cases with different levels of needs and different types of systems. A point of sale system can be on an iPad, but it could be on a more traditional terminal based system or if you're an older, we'll say, anchor stores, some of them are still in traditional mainframes. And those systems become an even harder and become even more of a challenge when it comes to identity, just the nature of that code being, I won't say legacy, but quite antique, if you will.
So many variables. So let's add a layer to it all. Supply chain. What are your top considerations around supply chain? And is there a particular challenge you're thinking about or facing these days when it comes to supply chain?
I think no CIO can think about supply chain issues and not think about impacts of tariffs, right? And I think it's at the top of mind of a lot of people, especially in retail. So if you think about retailers, a lot of retailers get consumer goods from China. They get a lot of hardware from China, and so there is a ramification of tariffs that will eventually in their way into the pricing for consumers. But not only from that perspective, but from a disruption in supply chain. So as these manufacturers, whether they be on the retail side in terms of shoes or clothing or even electronics, is we could be facing supply chain issues as people ramp up and purchase up certain levels of inventory before tariffs increase more, or trying to figure out, do they relocate certain manufacturing facilities, which take a while and are at quite a bit of cost. But I think when we think about supply chains, especially in the retail side, a lot of discussions are around what are the ramifications of tariffs? What does that mean for us? How are we going to handle that? I mean, there was just disruption this week, and the USPS said they were halting all shipments from Hong Kong and China. Now, it lasted, I think, all of not even 12 hours, but that was a concern, especially if you were a very small retailer that may have gotten product from companies like Temu and others from a retail perspective. And so where things get shipped in from will matter. And so certain levels of suppliers will go to other markets like Vietnam and Cambodia and source from other areas when possible, but it won't be possible for everybody. And large manufacturing takes a while to relocate if that's the concern. But I think, especially again in the retail sector, tariffs are a discussion point that's being talked at a lot of tables these days.
Global economy, lots of ripple effects,
Correct.
obviously. You were talking about the cash register with the key and the pen override protocol there. To go back to that for a second. So, digital transformation, how do you approach the challenge of digital transformation in your role while ensuring stringent cybersecurity measures?
I think there's several ways to look at it. I also think in wherever possible, when you start thinking about digital transformation and cybersecurity initiatives, is where do we view it from a human perspective, right? The idea is you don't transform for the sake of transformation. The idea is how can we make something more cost effective? How can we make an employee more productive? How can we take friction out of the equation as much as possible? I think when you think about what organizations are doing, how do you do biometrics in terms of doing authentications, right? Can you make it a lot easier by looking at a camera and showing your face rather than typing in a 14 character password that you're having a hard time remembering? And so the idea is with any of these, whether it be digital transformation or whether it be cybersecurity, how do we view it in the lens from what's the real return? And as we do the real return, can we do it in a way where we reduce friction as well? The last thing anybody wants to do is move to a new system and it's much more efficient, but it's a huge pain to work on, right? It's got a steep learning curve and anything like that. So the idea is, can we look at our tools that are better, more secure, but also are they easier to use? Are they more integrated? You've got tools now like I won't mention the actual manufacturer because we won't get in that, but there's methods where you can overlay and embed VPN connectivity. So when you boot up, the tunnels are already created. So you don't have to launch a VPN tunnel. There's tools out there within the operating system when you come in and come online that it looks at your face, authenticates who you are, unlocks the, system. Or when you step away, the camera's looking and says, well, JJ David's not there. Let me go ahead and lock the computer. These are ways where you're improving security and making it a lot less frictionless.
Looking at cloud based environments, what are the key considerations for maintaining security in a cloud based environment? And how do you balance the need for accessibility and security in cloud services?
Yeah, I think when you look at the security of, take any of your larger hypervisors out there, the security's there. They were some of the first to embed FedRAMP. They were the first ones to embrace all these levels of security. The fact is, when we talk about security, especially at a global organization, we also have to talk about geolocation, especially of data sovereignty, and where does that data set for a particular region. And so if you are looking at any of the big hypervisors in your global player, that becomes a critical partner because you have certain data that you can't move out of country. And you're not going to go in and build a traditional data center within France or Germany. It's just cost prohibitive. And so those are important from a level of compliance, not necessarily security, but when you think about levels of security and the fortifications the hypervisors have, and in fact, how to ward off giant denial of service attacks, they all play extremely well in that space. The security is all extremely good at this point. It's become paramount in what they do. I won't say there's a big differentiator between the top three, but it's there. I think when we also think about data center and data center selection, it's important to go back to that sort of question about where are you putting data. But also, if you think about how AI is driving data center consumption, it's become incredibly critical. If you think about GPUs and the amount of heat they produce and the amount of energy they produce, they're having major impacts on data center and energy consumption. So when you think about data centers in Europe, some of them are having to throttle how much expansion can happen because what's happened is all these AI type projects has taken up so much of the power resources, not necessarily compute resources or even rack resources, but power. And so the race to place data centers is becoming crucial. I live in Georgia. Vogtle Power Plant is the first nuclear power plant brought online in the United States in decades, of which more than 50% of that nuclear power plant's power will be dedicated not to homes, but to data centers in Georgia. And so a lot of that being driven by the GPU power consumptions of these AI chips. And so as you start to look at cloud strategies, it's not just about security strategy more, it's an energy consumption strategy. And where are you putting your data? And if you're putting your data in Ireland and you want to build out there, how much runway do you have before that becomes a power issue?
Right.
Again, it comes back to that earlier statement I made that never has it been more challenging in this role and never more fun. But now is the time where when you're setting these roles, you're thinking about geopolitics, you're thinking about energy consumption planning, you're thinking about societal matters. It's way beyond just the technology and the business aspect of it all. And then I think in a way you have to become a really good anthropologist.
That's really fascinating and a tremendous point, and a great segue into what I want to get to wrap this up, which is your role again. And we covered how you're both outward and inward facing. As a CIO, job framework that's essential is focusing on people, process, and technology, a common essential framework that is. So, what's your approach to managing the intersection of people, process, and technology? And how do you balance the three to drive innovation and maintain strong, some might call it robust, cybersecurity?
The ultimate common denominator on it is the people, right? When we think about our largest investments, it's still our talent. When we think about our workforce, for now, it's people. I do foresee in the next 5, 10 years, 10% of my workforce may be non-human. But while it's still the majority of human focused and human centric leadership, it's about those relationships. I've been fortunate enough to work in global organizations for a long time, but even though you can't be face to face, we still have to be able to connect. We still have to have that time and realize what is the common goal we're working on. When you can build those relationships and connect on that human level and making sure people understand the goals and that you're understanding that the people you're leading are more than just their job, it helps to drive decisions on what are we doing and why are we transforming? How do you get people motivated to change? Humans are very resistant to change. If you have a commuting job, you go about the same way every day. If you think about what you eat throughout the month, pizza probably pops up quite a bit. You have sort of these patterns. And so to get people to understand the need for change and why for change, it's about connecting on a human level. I talked about being an anthropologist. Well, also being a good technical leader is also being a politician. How do you sell the vision? How do you sell the dream? How do you sell limited resources in order to get an outcome? And so I think the best way of doing that is focus on the people.
On a side note, is the pizza any good in the Atlanta area?
No, not really.
Okay. Because I'm up in Boston and it's awful.
Yeah, there are some that are good, and these are typically Nepalese pizza makers that have came in, their first or second generation. Those are pretty great. But I was in New York recently, and every time I'm in New York, I miss the New York style pizza.
Thank you very much. There's so much to talk about here.
I
And
think having these conversations are important. I'm very interested in, writing and being part of groups where we can share ideas. Next week, I'll spend it at the Wall Street Journal CIO conference, which I am a member of. And so this idea of how do we come together regardless of industry and share what's working, but behind closed doors, CIOs love to share what's not working. I've been doing this for a long time and it's still interesting and it's getting more interesting every day, not only from the cybersecurity perspective, but from just the technology of it all. I have two young daughters and the technology that they'll use in their lifetime, we haven't even thought of yet. And my young kids, even at an early age, they're like, meh. I'm like, meh,
right.
what the hell are you talking about? How cool is that?
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, it's a robot. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, I would have been so blown away. And it's going to become so commonplace to their upbringing and what they do that it's just second nature. I was the first generation early on, especially growing up in Alabama, to have a PC. None of my friends did. And being able to connect in early stages of bulletin boards and then on the internet. But for them, it's just commonplace. And to see how much robots will play an important part of not only workforce, but ultimately putting back that healthcare hat on, ultimately in terms of end of life care and long-term care in terms of robotics is going to have tremendous impacts over the next just few decades.
It is all moving so fast. That is for sure. JJ, thank you so much for coming on to Security Matters. This has been really, really interesting, and we hope to have you back on again, if not soon, in the near future.
Thanks, David.
All right, there you have it. Thanks for listening to Security Matters. If you like this episode, please follow us wherever you do your podcast thing so you can catch new episodes as they drop. And if you feel so inclined, please leave us a review. We'd appreciate it very much, and so will the algorithmic wins. What else? Drop us a line with questions, comments, and if you're a cybersecurity professional and you have an idea for an episode, drop us a line. Our email address is securitymatterspodcast, all one word, @cyberark.com. We hope to see you next time.